Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, their.
In this episode, we'll discuss the scripture readings for the second half of Lent. Just a quick content warning before we begin. In the first reading for the fourth Sunday of Lent, we talk about colonization, slavery, and racism.
If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com, and you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
So our first Sunday for this episode is the third Sunday of Lent. This year that falls on March 24th. And our first reading for the third Sunday in Lent is from Isaiah chapter 55, verses 1 through 9. God announces an everlasting covenant with the people of King David, that God will continue to listen to them and forgive them, because God's ways are different from our ways.
So one of the themes that I noticed in this passage was the way that God's love for the ancestors, so in this case, King David, also extends down through the descendants. And that reminded me of the way that works in Harry Potter. We see it generationally because people have shorter lifespans than God. So we see it generationally instead of God's, like, for King David and everyone forever. But we see Sirius and Remus's love for James and Lily extend to Harry, and then we see Harry's love for Sirius and Remus extend, particularly Remus, to Teddy Tonks. And it's just this beautiful, because I loved your parents, I love you kind of thing.
It's like love overflowing.
Yeah, exactly.
And I kind of like the thought that real love overflows, and fake love or possessive love or jealous love or angry, abusive love, that doesn't overflow. That doesn't spread out the same way that real love does.
Yeah, well, and I think that maybe helps to be like a counterpoint to the idea of blood purity, right? Because pure blood's the idea is like, you're pure blood, therefore you're better, therefore we like you better. But that's, right. It's very limited. It's not an overflowing. This is right. The lineage, and that is it. And it doesn't go back and forth on a horizontal level so much. In verse 1, so side note, this passage was my first reading at my ordination.
Oh.
So I love this passage, especially because of this first verse, where we read, "Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you that have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price." I just love that idea of abundance and providing for everyone without really caring about the cost of it. And it reminds me of, I think this really only happens in the first train ride with Harry and Ron, where Harry, who has never had money ever and has never experienced any magical treats, when asked if he wants anything by the trolley witch, says, "We'll take the lot." And Ron has, his corned beef sandwiches, but they both end up just overflowing with all of this food and sweets and just sitting in it without paying attention to this was Harry's, and It's just an abundance for them to share.
Verse 2 has this piece about spending money in ways that don't satisfy. And that makes me jump right to Ludo Bagman and the Leprechaun Gold in Book 4. A very fun little bit that we seem to have overlooked so far, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder how long he thought he could get away with that. It was clearly just a stalling tactic so he could get out of the Wizarding World Cup and have another chance to get more money.
Yeah, and I think part of it for him was some of the people he was dealing with were rich enough that they probably just put it in their bag of gold and didn't notice.
Right.
Right? But
That's
when you're dealing
possible.
With Fred and George, who have invested their life savings in this one bet.
Not really the wisest choice. Yeah. And then when we get to verse 8, when you think about it, the phrase, "my ways aren't your ways, my thoughts aren't your thoughts," it kind of sounds like that could be Harry and Snape. I like to think of the two of them as having almost exactly opposite ways of approaching the world and solving problems. Harry is so naturally direct. I mean, some of that is because we meet him when he's 11, but he's very focused in his goals, and he just tries to go from point A to point B, and very driven. And Snape has been doing everything backhanded and subtly and trying to do things without people noticing for the last, 20 years or more. And so he has this whole different set of ways of doing things, and they do not understand each other at all. If you're thinking about people who have completely different ways of going about things, I think Harry and Snape are a good example. I don't care to choose which one of them would be God and which one of them would be humanity in this
Please,
example. That seems like a bad plan.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. I like that. It's not always easy to talk about either of those characters.
No.
And they both are trying to do their best when we encounter them in the books.
Yeah, Snape is a person who's full of faults, like everybody else, although his are really noticeable. But his way of going about things itself, it's perfectly natural to him. It's perfectly reasonable to see how that came about. And you can't really blame him for it. So
yeah. I actually, when I was thinking about this same line, I was thinking about how when I was first reading the books, that's kind of the approach that I took to Dumbledore, where I just had this idea, right, that Dumbledore was the God character, and I didn't understand how Dumbledore was working, but like...
presumably he knows what he's doing?
Yeah. And now as an adult, I look at it and I'm like, wow, that's like, how can you be responsible for any child ever? You are so irresponsible and dangerous, and so it's been interesting to see my own evolution in how I relate to Dumbledore as I've grown up through the books. But
I think a lot of us have the experience of treating authors or showrunners or movie directors or things like that in the same way. I remember when I used to watch Lost for the first couple seasons before I got tired of it.
Yep.
Oh, the approach that people had to that show was, of course the showrunners know what they're doing. There's going to be a big reveal and everything will be explained eventually, I'm sure, right? No, like half of the puzzles that they put in the show never came to anything, and they didn't explain any of it, and we never did figure out where half that stuff came from, and yeah.
That's hilarious. Yeah, my dad and I used to watch Lost, and he watched it for a lot longer than I did, but...
yeah.
Our second reading for the third Sunday in Lent is from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 13. Paul reminds the Corinthians of many trials that the Jewish people faced over the centuries, despite being loved by God, and exhorts them not to make the same mistakes as were made then. So one of the themes that I noticed was Paul's talking about the role of sacred texts, right? He's talking about the history and what the Jewish people have faced over the centuries, and he talks about it as like meant kind of like to teach as instruction, or as examples, and that's not how I read the Bible, right? Like the Bible is not an instruction book for life.
Or science.
It's not a history book, it's not a science book, it's not a how-to book. But I really love the way the podcast Harry Potter and the Sacred Text approaches the Harry Potter books as sacred texts. And so the approach is not how do we like do these magical spells, but what meaning can we find and what themes come out in a close reading of the text in each chapter? Where are we surprised? Where are we challenged? Who do we bless? That meaning making is what sacred texts are about, because that's what they tell. They tell the story of our meaning making and encourage us to continue making meaning out of life and our relationship with God. So the beginning part of this passage, verses 1b through 4a, as I was reading it, I couldn't help translating it into Harry Potter speak. So, I do not want you to be unaware, siblings, that our ancestors were all under the enchanted ceiling, and all passed through the black lake, and all were sorted into houses in the towers and in the dungeons, and all ate the same welcoming feast, and all drank the same...
pumpkin juice.
Yes! Except Mad-Eye Moody, of course.
And except for the people who were homeschooled, because apparently that was a thing. But
well, yes. Yeah. So I just loved that, the way that it fit really well with how people are welcomed and enter into Hogwarts in the magical world.
Sure. In verse 8, it mentions 20-some thousand people falling in a single day for sexual immorality. This is a reference to Numbers chapter 25, and the actual number of how many people died varies depending on which book you're reading. But they call it sexual immorality. Paul calls it sexual immorality here. Really what's going on in that passage in Numbers is that some of the Israelites were trying to, quote, bring foreigners into their families, specifically Midianites. And by bringing them into their families, he means marrying them and or not marrying, but, everything else. So it's not exactly an example of what we would call sexual immorality now. So, and this comment of Paul seems a little weird to me in terms of it doesn't really, I don't think it follows with the rest of the text as well. But if you're going to think about people marrying outside of their usual expected group, which for the ancient Israelites in Numbers was a crime, but this being after...
Maybe not a crime. Was it a crime or was it just against their customs?
Well, they killed them.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the whole reason why the plague that killed 20,000 of them ended was because the two people who had started the whole thing were stabbed with a spear. So, by a guy who got rewarded by God for it. It's a complicated passage.
Like most of the Bible. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
I'm trying to explain. Culture changes.
And if you're a minority culture, like, you want part of not marrying...
No, maintaining your identity. It could possibly take an entire cultural anthropology class to explain why the ancient Israelites would have killed people for trying to marry outside of their group. And we don't have time for that in the podcast. So, in the meantime, I'll just mention that if you're a small persecuted minority group that has just escaped slavery not too long ago, and is trying also to survive in a desert while surrounded by people who are trying to kill you, you're going to have some issues with people marrying foreigners. And God's opinion on this would have been very culturally based, presumably. God's relationship with the Israelites then and our relationship with God now and current Jewish people's relationship with God now, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's changed, frankly. So I'm not going to go into the details of that any further. But when you're thinking about people trying to marry outside of the accepted norm, that immediately tosses me in the Harry Potter world to Andromeda Black and Ted Tonks. Now, they did not get killed or die in a plague for it, so this is not a perfect analogy, but still, I think it's interesting that Andromeda not only married a Muggle, but their daughter is a Metamorph Magus, one of the most rare and powerful magical traits ever seen.
Yeah, they are like the epitome of that. Well, and then Tonks continues that, right, in marrying Remus. And I imagine if Sirius's family had found out about him and Remus, then he probably would have had similar treatment from them of ostracization and stuff.
Yeah.
Hashtag Emily's headcanons.
Although I don't know if it would be homophobia or werewolfophobia. Lycanphobia? Both?
I think it would be both. Towards the end of this passage, we have a verse. Verse 13 is a complicated verse. And the first part stuck out to me. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. So thinking about, like, the owls and the newts at Hogwarts are common to everyone. And they impact people differently, right? Like, Hannah Abbott has to go see Madame Pomfrey because she gets too stressed and she has a breakdown.
And the apparition test.
And the apparition test. Not everybody takes the apparition test. Not everybody wants to apparate. And so then when you say also that God is faithful and will not let you be tested beyond your strength, well, not everybody can apparate. That is testing beyond their strength. Not everybody passes all of their owls and their newts, but also in, like, daily life, plenty of people in Harry Potter are tested beyond their strength. How many people are killed? How many people are tortured past the point of recovery? There's this way that Paul's words are encouraging, but completely unrealistic.
Well, and that verse, especially the God won't let you be tested beyond your strength part, it has been horribly used and misused over the generations. And we've seen people excuse all kinds of terrible things with it and say that God meant for you to suffer this way. And no, God does not. No, that's not how this works.
God does not mean for anyone to suffer.
That's not how any of this works. This is why we can't have nice things. But I took a closer look at this verse about a year ago, I think it was, and I looked into the Greek, and I discovered something I hadn't noticed before, which was that the Greek for the you and the your part, the let you be tested and the your strength, the yous are not singular. They're plural.
Oh.
God will not let you all, God will not let humanity be tested beyond our collective strength.
Ooh, I like that.
I like that too, because I've been thinking about it for a while now. And when you think about it, okay, beyond climate change, which is humanity's fault anyway, we have enough land and resources to grow enough food to feed everyone. We have enough resources to be able to house everyone. We have enough resources to be able to do incredible work with disaster recovery. I mean, we can't actually stop tornadoes, but we can build buildings that are safer than ever for them, and we can help people rebuild after if necessary. We could work on medical research in a way that wasn't profit-driven and provide medical care in a way that wasn't profit-driven.
Oh my gosh, that'd be great.
Some people around the world have been doing this for quite a long time, but moving on.
Speaking as someone who is currently sick and recording, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not everything can be solved with chicken soup. So I think it's a much more interesting verse if you interpret it this way, that God won't let humanity be tested beyond our strength. I'm still kind of playing with that. I'm not entirely sure that it's perfect, but I like it a heck of a lot better than the singular version, don't you?
So much better.
If we're taking that concept into Harry Potter, at times it seemed in the Harry Potter universe that Voldemort was invincible, or that Grindelwald was invincible, or that something terrible was bound to happen, or, we can't do anything. And yet, when people work together, we keep discovering that we can do so much. And usually the truth is that we could do so much, we're just not willing to work together.
That is the ways that our strengths... there's this thing called the Strengths Finder that I really love, but that's part of it is that our strengths are other people's weaknesses and other people's weaknesses are our strengths. And instead of always trying to mitigate our weaknesses, we should live into our strengths and encourage other people to live into their strengths. And then we can carry everything.
Yeah, together. Our gospel reading for the third Sunday of Lent is from Luke chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. The crowd brings up the cruelty of the Romans to Jesus, who reminds them that those who died hadn't sinned any more or less than anyone else. Jesus then tells the parable of the fig tree and the gardener, who asked for one more year so it could bear fruit.
So one of the themes that comes up for me in this is the concept of victim blaming and how Jesus is clearly countering the victim blaming that people are trying to do of saying oh, what about this? What about this? Were they worse sinners? And Jesus is no, that's not how it works. Victims are not worse sinners just because they've been killed by someone. So it reminded me of the ways that the Corinthians reading, you could interpret verse 8 as the one that you mentioned of the people indulging in sexual immorality, and then the plague takes them over. And so this is kind of Jesus' counter to Paul's assertion that it was because of their sexual immorality, they were all killed by the plague. And Jesus is no, that's not how it works. It's not about victim blaming. It's not that these people were greater sinners. And I was trying to think of when there's victim blaming in the Harry Potter books. And I don't think that there's a lot of obvious victim blaming.
I mean, the purebloods assume that the Muggleborns and the Muggles deserve it all the time, but that's...
Right, Malfoy, especially in Chamber of Secrets, definitely thinks the Muggleborns deserve to be killed and petrified and stuff. But on other levels, I think most people refreshingly that's not how they operate, which is kind of cool. I mean, you could do when Ginny is dating, when the Weasley twins start to focus on who Ginny's been dating, and they're well, if you wouldn't go around snogging everybody, then wouldn't be our business. And that's victim blaming, right?
Dude, if I had two older brothers like that, I'd be anyway, no. Moving on.
I mean, specifically, right, in verse 1 and 4, the Galileans killed and the 18 killed by the Tower of Siloam reminded me in the war of the Muggles who are killed by Death Eaters, or even Frank Bryce, right? I can imagine people looking at him once they found out that he was dead because they'd been suspecting him of evil, of killing the Riddles this whole time, even though he didn't do it. But he's kind of creepy and he's kind of mean, and so I could see people looking at him and thinking maybe he deserved it, which is terrible. And like Jesus is clear that that's not what happens. That's not how it works. But we still seem to fall into that trope.
Yeah. And in verses 6 through 9, I am very fond of this parable because it reminds me of an episode of one of my favorite TV shows, Leverage. The 4th episode of season 1 is called The Miracle Job. And they save a church from being destroyed by a developer. And there's a scene in the show where a priest gives a homily on this parable. And for a TV homily, it's not bad.
Wow.
Which is pretty decent.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the portrayal of Christianity and Catholicism in this particular episode is pretty good. There's a bit where the guy who's playing the priest explains the concept of, no, you're not allowed to plan to sin and then apologize for it beforehand in a way that actually makes sense earlier in the show. But in this homily, he takes this parable of the fig tree and uses it to talk about how God doesn't procrastinate like we do. He starts in by talking about the temptation of procrastination and goes from there into, but some things do take time. God is always with us. God is always working on it, but sometimes even for God, it's going to take time to get this stuff done. So I liked that. And in Harry Potter, that makes me think of Polyjuice Potion. Because magic is wonderful and miraculous and can do amazing things and is so powerful, but there's still stuff like Polyjuice Potion that takes forever to frickin' brew.
Or to become an animagus, it takes forever.
Yeah. So I love the fact that there's still stuff in Harry Potter that it doesn't matter how powerful of a wizard you are. It's still going to take you a while to do this. That's just how things work.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's hilarious. Like, this guy buys a tree and then, doesn't know anything about how fig trees work. And that, the first 3 years, you shouldn't expect any fruit. And he's like, I want to be hashtag typical man. And the gardener is like, no, wait, give it one more year because this is the year that it's supposed to grow fruit. Yeah. And I could totally see Sprout as the gardener and Slughorn as the guy that just wants to harvest the fruit, right? Because he's always after whatever will get him money fast. And
yeah.
And so them having a conversation and Sprout being like, no, wait, one more time, just hang on, we got this. Mm-hmm. Our next Sunday for this episode is Lent 4, which falls this year on March 31st. The first reading for this episode is from Joshua chapter 5, verses 9 through 12. The Israelites who have wandered the desert for 40 years after escaping slavery in Egypt celebrate Passover and then end their exile by eating the crops of Canaan. So God's gift of manna to them ends. So the theme that makes the most sense for me in this passage is God's provision, right? God provides for the Israelites for as long as they need it until they start to not need it anymore because there are local crops that they can eat and are eating.
Sure.
I think as we go through this, I'm increasingly drawn to the idea of Hogwarts itself as a God figure in the Harry Potter books. It provides what is needed to resist, except when it can be acquired elsewhere or must be acquired elsewhere. Hashtag Gamp's Law. But even, the room of requirement creates a passageway anyway, and Hogwarts itself resists during the Battle of Hogwarts.
Which always makes me think of the Disney movie of Beauty and the Beast and the castle fighting back.
Oh my gosh, that is a good one. Yeah, but I just love that idea of like Hogwarts as the provider, and then except when it's not needed or it can't be needed.
Sure.
For verse 9, I was struck by the phrasing that God says to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt," and wondering whose disgrace it was, right? Was it the disgrace of the Israelites that they were enslaved? Was it the disgrace of the Egyptians that they were enslaving people, right? Kind of thinking about the way, like, in that time, being naked would be a disgrace for everyone around you, but not for you.
Right.
And so wondering kind of what the perspective is for disgrace. And that reminded me of the conversation between Arthur Weasley and Lucius Malfoy in Chamber of Secrets when they're at Flourish and Blotts at the beginning of the book. And Malfoy's flips through like the used books that the Weasleys are buying, and so Malfoy says, "Busy time at the ministry, I hear," said Mr. Malfoy. "All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime." And then he flips through Ginny's old books and says, "Obviously not," Mr. Malfoy said. "Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name of wizard if they don't even pay you well for it?" And then Mr. Weasley responds, and I love this, and says, "We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizard, Malfoy." And Malfoy says clearly, because it is very clear. But, like, Malfoy thinks disgracing wizards are challenging the purebloods, or trying to care for muggles, or care about muggles, or learn about muggles, or value muggles, or muggleborns. And Arthur thinks that disgracing wizards, the name of wizard, is being a terrible person and discriminating against other people and looking down on other people. And I think Arthur has it
torturing people. And,
right.
Yeah, I guess when I think about how do you interpret the word disgrace in that passage, I read it more as shame rather than guilt, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I read it, I was thinking along the lines of when you've had a terrible experience, something that scars you, just getting past the part where it's being inflicted on you, that doesn't mean it's truly over. I mean, it's over, but it's not over, if that makes sense. The effects are still felt for a long time afterwards. And if you've been enslaved as a people for 400 years, it's going to take a while to get past, I mean, even just the immediate effects after the escape from Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was thinking it was more along the lines of this is the moment when the immediate after effects of the people who actually lived that, this is when they are finally to the point where they are able to have enough space emotionally from that to live their lives. It's been 40 years they've been wandering in the desert. They've probably been, emotionally scarred by some other stuff, because wandering in the desert isn't easy.
There was that thing with all the snakes.
Yeah, there are some pretty scary stories in there. But the immediate after effect of the slavery has finally been mitigated somewhat. They can feel, now that they have a place to live of their own, they can feel truly free of being slaves in Egypt, rather than considering themselves slaves on the run, or escaped slaves, or exiles, or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, looking at the Harry Potter canon, I wonder how long it took, living on his own after Hogwarts. Did it take Harry to stop thinking of himself as, now I'm finally living free of the Dursleys, as opposed to, this is just my life? Or how long did it take him to get from, I'm not at Hogwarts anymore, to, this is life, I chose this is me?
Yeah.
Because it would have taken a while to get to that point, I think.
Mm-hmm. I just thought while you were talking about that, this year marks 400 years since the first people who were kidnapped and enslaved arrived from Africa, and thinking about both the progress we've made and the short amount of time, right? Because even after slavery ended, there's been all of this stuff, and slavery is still allowed if you are in prison. And so we now have more people imprisoned than, and therefore enslaved, than during slavery. And thinking about the ways that, right, like if house elves are going to achieve freedom from oppression, like they have to, it's been so trained into them generation after generation after generation to be subservient and to be enslaved, and how long that takes.
Dobby would have been dealing with that.
Right?
Yeah.
And especially now that Dobby's not there. And then to think about like our own culture and how long is it going to take us to, for those of us who are white, to stop thinking that it's okay to enslave people as long as they're in jail or they're criminals, or to stop
sweatshop workers,
right? To stop calling the police just because we don't want people of color in a certain place or we don't think that they belong.
In verse 12, with the end of the gift of manna, the Israelites are now responsible for taking care of themselves, at least about food, from now on. And that makes me think of Harry at all of 11, cooking for the family, not because it's his turn, not because they're trying to make sure that he knows what to do when he's a grown-up, but because he's being seen as a servant in his own home. He was responsible for himself in a lot of ways, a lot younger than most people would have been. But it wasn't because he should have been responsible for himself that early. It was because he was being treated as lesser than, which is a difference because the Israelites were not being treated that way by God with the gift of manna. Mm-hmm. And I feel that we should mention at this point that the crops that the Israelites are eating at this point in this Bible passage, they aren't crops that they grew themselves. They have been traveling all this time and they've just arrived.
They didn't just happen
these
upon.
Are crops, they don't accidentally happen upon fields that were just abandoned. No, they've driven the Canaanites out through war and a lot of violence.
And intimidation.
And so they are eating abandoned crops by those that were grown by those who have died or who have been forced out into an exile of their own.
Yeah, and that's something, especially with the book of Joshua, right? That's something that as pastors, okay, you and I wrestle with a lot.
Yeah.
Because this also is one of the passages that was used to justify manifest destiny and to justify white settlers taking over and committing genocide in this country to take over land inhabited by Native Americans, Native peoples.
Yeah, they didn't even need God to show up in a giant fiery pillar and yell at them, or in a bush to do it. So
yeah, and even like it is interesting because like even in Harry Potter, when Hermione, Ron, and Harry are all wandering in the wilderness, even when they steal from people, Hermione like leaves money for them, because she feels guilty and because like they can't be seen and they can't interact with people and they need food.
And she can't actually know whether or not these people can afford to lose what they've taken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even that, right, like it's still not right to steal. And that is so much better than
what they could have done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. When I try to explain that kind of thing, the colonization and the war and so on in the Bible and God's apparent involvement with it. There are some ways that humanity has changed and there are some ways that humanity has not. And one of them is that we continue to make war and we continue to effectively colonize even if we don't do it the same ways that we used to.
Mm-hmm.
Gentrification is kind of an obvious example.
Mm-hmm.
But humanity has changed in some ways in that we are actually less violent now than we ever have been before. There is less violence in the world. A smaller number of people percentage-wise die by violence now than ever before.
Well, depending on what you call violence.
Well, yes, by people hacking at each other with swords and guns and so on. Let's put it that way. As opposed to, say, the violence of poverty or something like that. The Bible, ultimately speaking, was communicated to and then written down by a people of a certain time and place. And so the stories that are told in the Bible made sense to them because they were the ones who got to interpret what God said and write it down.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that means that the Bible has no meaning for us. It does, absolutely. But there's a fair amount of cultural interpretation that has to go on. We have to understand a certain amount of where are they coming from, what do they mean by this, what would this have meant to them in order for us to get the gist of what they're saying. And we haven't always been right about that either.
Mm-hmm. That's true. In verse 10, we hear that they kept the Passover in the evening on the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. And I just how do they even keep track of the days of the month? 40 years wandering in the wilderness, they can't write it down and just have a calendar on their wall because they don't have walls. They're living in tents and they have to put them down and take them off.
Well, just because our calendars are on the walls doesn't mean theirs would have been.
I know, but you have to carry it.
I have an idea for you. I don't know how you're going to like it. I was reading an article this morning that it was that article that's been going around lately about how the default position for everything being designed for men actually hurts and can sometimes kill women.
Oh.
And for example, crash test dummies and stuff like that.
Yeah, seatbelts never fit me.
Yeah, and we still don't know how to make a seatbelt that fits a pregnant woman, and yet you would think someone would care. So one of the things that got brought up was they told a story of a teacher holding up a piece of antler that had been marked with 28 hashes on it. And then it had some method of marking which one of the hashes was that. And it was clearly a calendar. So you could count for 28 for about a month, right? And the label for that was, "This is an example of one of man's first calendars." And the teacher looked at it and said, "Okay, this is a calendar for 28 days. I don't think it's men that needed to keep track of a period of time of about 4 weeks long."
Right, it's people who
I think this would be an example of one of women's first calendars. And I think that would have had a big impact on people's ability to keep track of how long it had been that they'd been wandering in the wilderness.
True, the people who menstruate probably would have kept track. Because I was going to say, Hermione and Harry only figure out that it's Christmas Day in Deathly Hallows because they literally drop into Godric's Hollow on Christmas Eve, and people are at church singing Christmas songs.
Yeah, but Harry and Hermione did not grow up in that culture with, traveling with a piece of antler with 28
days. It's true.
Days
they should have gotten an antler.
Yeah. Or perhaps just, a calendar of some sort that they could have marked off the days on. I'm sure Hermione could have worked up a
Where's
calendar.
her planner?
They don't have any homework this year. That's the problem.
That is the problem.
Our second reading for this Sunday is from 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 16 through 21. God has made all things new through Christ, and has reconciled the entire world and all of history, an immense act of grace and forgiveness.
So one of the themes for this passage, which is a passage that I love, is newness and renewal. And so thinking about when people really get the opportunity to start over. And there's a certain extent to which it happens every year, but the kind of big newness and the big renewal that I think God is up to is Draco, I think, is one of the few characters who really has this opportunity. I mean, I think Snape does pre-book history, but in Half-Blood Prince, when Draco and Dumbledore, and unbeknownst to Draco, Harry, are on top of the tower, Draco is clearly not going to kill Dumbledore at this point, and yet all of these Death Eaters are coming, and he doesn't know what to do, and he says that they're going to kill him if he doesn't kill Dumbledore, and yet Dumbledore offers him protection and safety for him and his family, a chance to start over and leave behind those evil things and the Death Eaters and Voldemort and all of that. And it's just this opportunity for newness and renewal. Now, Draco doesn't decide fast enough, and so they catch up, and so it doesn't happen. But I think even just that spark and that the knowledge that there was an offer and that opportunity existed probably impacts those little moments that we see where Draco hesitates and where he doesn't commit egregious acts of evil.
In verse 17, we hear that everything old has passed away. Behold, everything has become new. And I have said before that I was reading the books to an extent as they came out. I started reading Harry Potter just before book 4 was published. So I was actually there for the 7th book finally coming out, and everyone finally got to find out what happened and all that. Mm-hmm. And there was a sizable chunk of fandom that kind of expected Harry winning to fix all the problems in the wizarding world, you know? That once Voldemort was gone, Hermione would get to take over as soon as possible, basically, and everything would be perfect. But as Cursed Child shows, and as the more realistic of us will admit, that's not really going to be the case. Mm-hmm. Only God can make all things new. And as it says in verse 18, that we're given the ministry of reconciliation. That is our work. We're told that what we do really matters. The relationships that we reconcile are part of doing God's work in the world. And my favorite Harry Potter example of this is actually from a fan fiction story called Dissipation and Despair, which I will not go into too deeply because Emily is currently reading it. But it's by A.J. Hall, and it's a sequel to another one of my favorites. And there's a part in this story where Harry, having previously put Neville into mortal danger by assuming that all of Neville's relatives were obviously perfectly trustworthy and not, say, at all similar to the Dursleys. So, having done this in this scene, he abjectly apologizes and admits that he was an idiot and should have known better.
Yeah, I don't think I've gotten to that part yet.
He does a decent job of it.
You know,
I won't spoil you for anything else.
I think he grows, so I can imagine him doing a decent job. I can't imagine Ron doing a decent job of it, but, you know.
Even Ron grows in this series. We don't see it as much, but so.
That's good. In verse 19, when Paul talks about in Christ, God was reconciling the world to God's own self, not counting their trespasses against them and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. Continuing that theme of reconciliation that you were talking about, on a smaller level, I was thinking about Harry and Dudley's reconciliation-ish at the beginning of Deathly Hallows when they're going their separate ways and Dudley reaches out and shakes Harry's hand. And then Harry can look back at what has happened right at the teacup of cold tea that he thought was a booby trap and was maybe just Dudley trying to be kind. Or even the nod that Draco and Harry share in the epilogue of Deathly Hallows, right? Those little moments of acknowledgement that things haven't been as right as they should have been, and that's not the desire going forward. And then in verse 20, when Paul talks about, so we are ambassadors for Christ, and I just had a thought of gosh, I hope we're better ambassadors for Christ than Fudge is for magic.
Yeah, let's all hope that.
Oh, because he's a terrible ambassador to the Prime Minister, both as a minister of magic and as his, after minister thing.
I sent you a link the other day that you enjoyed, saying that it's mentioned in one of the books that Cornelius Fudge had been thrown out the window by one of the previous ministers, heavily implied to be Margaret Thatcher, who I can totally see throwing someone out of a window. And someone also went to the trouble of figuring out that given her terms of office and Cornelius Fudge's terms of office, he would not have been her first minister of magic. And so she threw him out the window not because he was magical, but because he was incompetent.
Yes, that was hilarious, and we'll include that in the links for this episode. Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 3 and 11b through 32. Jesus tells the parable of the prodigal son, a story of unearned love and forgiveness despite insult. One of the themes here is entitlement. So we see entitlement both in, and I don't mean entitlements, as in the things that we are entitled to as citizens and residents in this country, but entitlement as in when the younger child in the parable basically tells his dad he's as good as dead to him and asks for his share of the inheritance, or the entitlement of the elder becoming upset when the younger comes back and dad welcomes the younger one home. And so the easiest place to go for entitlement in Harry Potter is Draco, obviously. He is pure blood, rich kid entitlement to a T. He thinks he's entitled to know everything. He's entitled to other kids' stuff, right? He comes and grabs the Remember All from Neville. He, in the movies, when they're in the Slytherin common room, he picks up the present and is is this yours? And when Harry and Ron / Crabbe Goyle say no, he just puts it in his pocket.
Yeah.
And I think a more complicated understanding of entitlement would be even with Dumbledore, right? The way that, especially as a youth and young adult, Dumbledore, I think, felt entitled because of his intelligence, because he's brilliant, for sure.
Yeah.
But felt...
And Hermione didn't, really. I mean, she claimed the time from and the investment from her professors that she needed, but she didn't have that same feeling that we get from Dumbledore when we see him being young.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think a lot goes into that, right? If we read race and gender into it.
And being Muggle-born, I think.
Yeah. And so, like, having Dumbledore who thinks he's entitled to, like, be brilliant and do all of these things and not be held accountable for these different things, and it bites him in the butt.
Boys will be boys.
Right? Like, boys will be boys is the epitome of, like, terrible entitlement.
In verse 2, people complain about Jesus because he welcomes sinners and eats with them. And I have not actually gotten to use this line in my own history of ministry, but I am just waiting for someone to complain about who I choose to eat with, so I can claim this line as having good precedence for eating with whoever the heck I want to. But eating with people who we disapprove of but don't understand, eating with people who are different from us, is such an important step to reconciling relationships. I mean, eating with people in general has always had special meaning to it, has always had a certain weight to it. There's a reason why cafeterias were segregated for so long in this country. The idea of eating with someone of the gender that you're attracted to while you're both on your own together, explaining to people that's not a date takes like 25 fucking minutes and they still don't believe you, you know? Or in ancient times, and even today in some places, if you are carrying a weapon of some sort and you sit down to a meal with someone, you remove the weapon first. Or you unload your gun, or you put your sword on the shelf or whatever, but you put it out of your reach to show that you're going to be peaceable during the meal. And so there's a lot of weight to that. And I hope that at Hogwarts, the tables in the Great Hall start getting a little bit more mixed up on a regular basis after all they've gone through. I hope that the students start eating with people of different houses more often. Maybe they do only your house at your table at supper, but for the other meals, people sit wherever they want. I don't know. I do understand the importance of house bonding.
Or they have different types of tables, like the round tables or something.
Yeah, sure. Like lots of little round tables instead of the 4 big ones, yeah. Man, those kids, all of them, could use more inter-house friendships. I mean, if Neville had gotten to spend more time with the Hufflepuffs, he would have been so much more... Or even the Ravenclaws, and talking about herbology with the Ravenclaws. He would have been so much more self-resilient and self-confident.
Yeah. In the Hogwarts Mystery App game, I eat meals with friends all the time. And
yes,
only some of them are fellow Ravenclaws. In verse 13, when the younger son runs away from the family and does his own thing, it really sounds like Sirius to me. Right? Like he's not dealing with all of the family pressure or any of that. And then in verse 29, at the end of the younger son's time away, when he comes back and dad's throwing a party and the older son is like, "Listen, for all these years, I have been working like a slave for you." And really? No, you haven't. No, son.
Not like a slave, because you're not one.
Yeah. I totally imagined Dumbledore feeling like that after his parents died, where he wanted to be out conquering the world, intellectually at least, and he was stuck with his family. And he even talks about that's how he felt about it. Right, and he didn't even have anybody to complain to except for Grindelwald. But it was just feeling so stuck and unappreciated and to disastrous ends.
Yeah. Yeah, I always use the story of the prodigal son as an example of how people read and interpret the Bible very differently, depending not just on what church did you go to growing up, or what did people tell you to do, or stuff like that, but also on your own personal history and background. Because people have a very different approach to, say, the older brother in this story, if their family actually had someone like the younger brother in it. Mine did. And so I read the older brother, despite the unfortunate slavery comment, as essentially trying to be protective of his family. He's expressing a certain amount of selfishness here, but I don't think his instinct is ultimately selfish. I think the instinct is originally protection, and that's what he's been trying to do all this time, and then this guy comes back, and he doesn't want his father to lose everything to this kid again, like he did the first time. And I wonder how Harry would read the story differently from, say, Ron, who actually has brothers, or differently from Draco, who actually grew up rich. I think all three of them would have very different takes on it. Or for that matter, Aberforth.
Mm-hmm. I also wonder,
You know?
how Molly would read the story, right? We hear nothing
Of the
mom/wife.
Yeah.
And I wonder what it would have been like for her. Or what if there were sisters? Or what if the whole thing were gender swapped, right? Like, what if it were daughters and a mother? And how would that change things? Yeah.
Well, the younger daughter never would have been able to leave and take her inheritance with her, and, without getting married. Maybe instead of going off and being rich, she would have gone off and married some guy who turned out to be a louse or something, and I don't know.
I mean, she could have gotten her inheritance thanks to
dowry.
The daughters of Zelophehad had. Hagla, Mala, Noah, Milcah, and Tirzah.
Yes, but her parents actually would have had to die for that.
True, but that's essentially what the younger child is saying, is like, you're as good as dead to me. Just give me my money now.
Molly would approve of the dad, and not be at all surprised by the older brother. And also probably not be at all surprised by the younger brother.
Yeah, but, like, I want to know what's going on with the mom. Like, she just, I don't like when there are no words.
I know. Also, I kind of wonder how this story is different if you assume that the mother has died.
Whoa.
If these kids are all the dad has left.
Ooh.
That really explains him welcoming the younger son back like this a lot more, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I've read different stories about... I mean, I don't have any personal experience because I look almost exactly like my mother, but my parents divorced when I was 10, so they don't really have that feeling toward each other. Thank goodness. But what happens when one parent dies and one of the kids looks a lot like that parent, and then the other parent sees them, there's a bit in one of the later Anne of Green Gables books where Anne's neighbors with a man who has 4 kids and his wife has died, and one of his daughters has her eyes, and none of the other kids do. So his relationship with her is a little different because they all kind of resemble a mix of him and his wife, but she's the only one with her eyes. And so there's a moment or two about that during the books. And I kind of wonder if maybe the prodigal son, if his mom had died, and maybe he's the kid that resembles her more.
Yeah, maybe. Like Harry, he has his mother's eyes.
Exactly, yeah. We can make this stuff up all day. Well, that's another podcast. I'm sure that there are probably podcasts out there for inventing backstories to parables, just like there is one for Harry Potter and the Bible. So,
pretty sure it's like something about Midrash.
Yeah. The Jewish people would be a lot better at it than us. Actually, I think Amy Jill Levine has like 47 different books on this, doesn't she?
She's brilliant.
That's fair.
Short Stories by
her.
Jesus. We'll include a link to it. Short Stories by Jesus by Amy Jill Levine is the best. And
I think she has a new thing out about understanding the Bible from that perspective too, but I don't remember what it's called. Our last Sunday for this episode is the 5th Sunday of Lent, which this year falls on April 7th. And our first reading for that is from Isaiah chapter 43, verses 16 through 21. Isaiah declares that the God who delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt will also deliver them from exile in Babylon.
So one of the fairly obvious themes in this one is deliverance, the theme of deliverance, and I'll get into it more specifically for some of the examples, but I was thinking about the Patronus as an instrument or a symbol or a character of deliverance that, especially in Order of the Phoenix, right, when the Patronus literally delivers Dudley and Harry from the Dementors, but it the way that it makes a path and pushes things away.
True. Yeah, I was kind of thinking maybe Portkeys as well, but I like the way that the Patronus pushes things out of the way. That's a good one.
Especially in the 3rd book, when all of the Dementors are coming, Harry's Patronus from across the lake is like one who's making a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters, right? Like the sea of Dementors just gets like, you can't see my arm motions, but they're like sweeping and making room.
When we reach verse 18, we got this whole bit about don't remember old things anymore. We're talking about new things now. And this is a great example of why you don't, and I repeat, don't want to pull a verse out of context and use it all on its own, as though it still means the exact same thing without its context, because it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
This passage is actually reminding the people of Israel of an old thing. I mean, that's kind of the point. We're talking about the delivery from slavery,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can use that to expect the delivery from exile in Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
So this verse in context clearly means more along the lines of, well, forget about that because wait till you see this. As opposed to, no, seriously, just stop thinking about all that old stuff. That's not what's going on here. No. Just like if you pull one line out of the Harry Potter canon, it probably also wouldn't mean the same thing without context. Like, say, if you pulled out the line, I must not tell lies, and used that as an example of a rule from the Harry Potter books that you should follow in your own life. You know, that's actually going to mean some things you really don't want it to. There's some baggage there.
Yep. So in verse 19, we specifically get God's declaration that God will make a way in the wilderness. And I was thinking about the Weasleys' car in Chamber of Secrets and the way that, right, like they encounter it and then they keep looking for, it trundles away and they keep looking for spiders. And then when they're like in super trouble because Aragog's given them all of the information and then is like, why would I keep my family from eating you? That doesn't make sense. It is the Weasley's car that saves the day and that literally makes a way in the wilderness of the Forbidden Forest, crashing through and making a path and rescuing them and bringing them out.
When we arrive at verse 20, we get this whole bit about God knows that all the animals will honor him, including the jackals and the wild ostriches and all that. And okay, so there's this bit at the end of the book of Jonah, for example, where there are the people are instructed to have even their livestock go into mourning and wear sackcloth and ashes. And that's supposed to be humor, okay? Because the idea of chickens having ashes on their forehead and running around in burlap sacks is hilarious. That's funny. That's fine, sure. I am not entirely sure that this is supposed to be funny, and yet I read it as kind of funny anyway, because the idea of God being excited about jackals and ostriches bowing down to God
and
is kind of ridiculous. And I did that one on purpose. But yeah, it's kind of silly anyway.
And, right, like the idea of jackals and ostriches is...
Yeah, standing next to each other, and I don't know how that works. And
like bowing down, right? Like the ostrich is just going to bury its head. But, like, the jackal is just going to be, like, laughing, and that's not bowing down.
Yeah. That's not going to... Yeah, those are not terribly reverent animals. And it kind of reminds me in the Harry Potter books of when Hermione conjured those birds, and she was just having fun with them for a little while, and then Ron started being an idiot, and she sent them after Ron. You know, you're supposed to see that as a genuine sign of her anger, but also the image of, them having a moment of... Alfred Hitchcock in Hogwarts is pretty hilarious. And Ron being Tippi Hedren is also pretty amusing. So, yeah.
Especially because they're like little chirpy birds and not even like scary birds.
Yeah.
In verse 21, God says, "The people whom I formed for myself so that they might declare my praise." And it struck me as something that Dumbledore might not say about, like, Dumbledore wouldn't necessarily articulate it this way, but Fudge definitely thinks that Dumbledore thinks that's what he's up to, right? Like Fudge thinks that Dumbledore is up to forming all of the students to declare his praise and do his will in Order of the Phoenix, which is absurd.
See, as opposed to my first thought, which is, this is not something that Paul from the New Testament would actually say out loud, but man, he might think it pretty loudly.
Oh my gosh, he totally would. Oh, Paul.
Yeah. Speaking of which,
our second reading for this Sunday is from Philippians chapter 3, verse 4b through 14. Paul reminds the people of Philippi that God's love for us is not based on our heritage or anything we've done to earn it, because Christ has put us all in right relationship with God. So one theme in this passage is pointless prestige. So we get Paul's like prestigious pedigree of all of the things that he could boast about. And gosh, I feel like I'm really like knocking Draco throughout this episode. But Draco...
We don't usually talk about him as much, but, we haven't brought up Umbridge once this episode, so I think we're kind of getting onto a new track.
Well, speaking of, I think part of it is because I've been sick, so I haven't been at the gym to read Order of the Phoenix.
Ah, true.
But Draco's pureblood, wealthy pedigree is really important to him and in the pureblood world, but really actually means nothing and is not important. Like, the wealthiness matters insofar as it impacts the way that he lives and the way that other people are not able to live because he has all the wealth. But it's not the important, like, those aren't the things that matter at school. Beginning this passage with that list of, if anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. It definitely, like, on first read, to me, is like Paul doing a great imitation of Lockhart bragging, right? Oh, I'm the winner of Witch Weekly's Most Perfect Smile, and I'm an Order of Merlin, whatever class, and I'm this and I'm this, but I don't need to brag. Like, I could brag about all of these things, but I won't.
Yeah, and I still wonder how on earth Lockhart managed to get himself an Order of Merlin.
I mean, it comes from Fudge, though, right?
Oh, I suppose that's true. I guess I kind of imagined that the Wizengamot was in charge of that sort of thing, but I suppose that's...
But, I don't know then.
But yeah, I suppose they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that Paul sounds like a whiny Draco from the first couple books in this verse, but the truth is that, for once, he's not actually bragging. He's pointing out that he would have a great reason for bragging, but even he doesn't need to, because Jesus. Because Jesus is a pretty good reason.
I mean, yes, it's a good hashtag. Hashtag because Jesus. The thing about Paul's letters is that they were originally oral, right? And so you can tell, like, if somebody had this as scripture by
They were
heart,
meant to be read out loud.
The inflections would be very different than when I read it on paper. And I had someone actually do that with Philemon, and it totally shifted how I thought about Philemon. And so I can see how, like, the way that Paul is actually, like, talking about this is not braggy, but really it just sounds braggy the way I read it.
Also, we're kind of used to being irritated by Paul.
Yep.
To be honest.
Especially today.
So he has the bedside manner of a neurosurgeon.
Ugh.
As in, not really much.
Yeah. That's not what he's getting paid for.
Yeah. Well, although that's weird, because he really is, I mean, that's his job. He's to go around and talk to people and convince them to be Christian, and yet in the written versions of stuff, I mean, he must have been a really excellent public speaker.
Yeah.
Because the written versions are not really the ideal.
True.
But at least for us. But they weren't really all that big on pride back then either. So.
Yeah. Towards the end of this passage, Paul keeps talking about the things that he's taking on as his own. And particularly in the NRSV, which is more or less the version that I was using, it sounds kind of like the opposite of Harry's Hogshead speech, where in Order of the Phoenix, where everybody's like, oh, but Harry, you did this, and you did this, and you did this. And Harry's like, really, I had help with this, and this person helped me with this, and they did this, and this, and kind of deflecting all of the credit away from him. And Paul's like, and I'm taking this on myself, and I'm taking this on myself, and I'm taking this on myself.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of a funny contrast.
Harry's just such a Gryffindor. He could have used a few more Hufflepuffs.
But he wasn't even taking it on himself. He wasn't being Gryffindorish in the Hogshead speech. He was, like, being Hufflepuffy.
Well, no, he wasn't taking credit, but he was taking responsibility. He and not necessarily in the Hogshead speech, but for everything else. He always expected that he was going to have to do stuff, and then he went and got friends to help him, but he could have had a lot more help, because he always depended on Ron and Hermione.
And he actually didn't try and get help. Yeah, I thought you meant in the Hogshead speech. I was like, no, the Hogshead speech, he was, like, really clear, like, no, I didn't.
Yeah. And I also get the feeling that he's just not, I mean, even by this point, he's still not used to being the center of attention, and it just seems to bother him. And that's fair. In verses 12 and 13, this whole has Paul made resurrection his own thing, it's phrased like 4 different ways in these couple of verses. It must be so difficult to properly translate this between languages, because depending on where you put the emphasis, it can mean totally different things. And that makes me think of the title of the first book being changed from Philosopher's Stone in Britain to being Sorcerer's Stone in America, because the Sorcerer's Stone isn't actually a thing that exists. the Philosopher's Stone is an ancient legend, but the publishers, who, had never actually had a Rowling book in their hands before, thought that American readers wouldn't want to read a book with the word philosopher in its title. And so now the American version is stuck with a title that makes no sense, and it's one of the most popular series in the history of the world, and yet the title makes no sense in America because they thought we were not going to be able to figure that out. To be fair, I have no idea whether or not the books would have taken off like they did if it had the Philosopher's Stone title in America, but they did get awfully popular everywhere else, so.
Yeah.
I find that story really interesting.
The ways that we
bring ourselves down to the lowest common denominator?
Yeah.
Or even lower?
That sounds like terrible, but like...
expect the least from each other?
Underestimate ourselves.
Yeah. Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Mary of Bethany, Jesus' friend, anoints his feet, and upon accusatory questioning by Judas, Jesus explains why.
One of the themes in this passage for me was lavish love, right? The like over-the-top kind of love, which is what Mary's anointing is. And so I was thinking about who has that kind of love in Harry Potter, and while Madame Puddifoot's kind of embodies it on Valentine's Day, it doesn't quite work out that way for Harry and Cho. But Lavender's love for Ron kind of feels pretty over the top, pretty lavish, even though it's not quite reciprocated the same way, but we see either in the movies or in the books, right? Ron is complaining that his lips are chapped, or she gives him something to wear to like symbolize how much they love each other, or all those things. Yeah, and so I was just thinking about Lavender in that role. Or, I mean, anybody that gets a love potion would be over the top. So when Ron does accidentally drink the love potion that Romelda Vane left for Harry, he's like way over the top on it.
Yeah.
In verse 3, when Mary pours out the nard and anoints Jesus' feet, it reminded me of the scene in the hospital wing in Half-Blood Prince after the fight at the end of the book, when Bill has been attacked by Greyback and the Weasleys finally arrive, both Arthur and Molly, and then also Fleur, and Mrs. Weasley is like crying over Bill and like thinks that Fleur's not going to want to marry him anymore, and Fleur snatches the ointment from Mrs. Weasley and is like, I'm pretty enough for both of us, and cares for Bill, right? But she takes that on herself and is caring for Bill in that space.
Yeah.
And then the response from Judas for this action of Mary's is to ask why the perfume was not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor. And I feel like that's kind of a Snape-ish question. Where...
Even snappish?
Snappish. Oh, that's cute. So this sort of way of asking the question really reminded me of the way that Snape asks questions like this, especially when it comes to Harry. So like specifically in Chamber of Secrets, when Harry and Ron and Hermione all have been to the Death Day party, and then they didn't go to the Hogwarts Halloween feast because Harry heard a voice, and so they're found at the scene when Mrs. Norris is petrified. And so then Snape, after Filch is like accusing them and all of that stuff, and Snape says, "If I might speak, Headmaster, Potter and his friends may have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but we do have a set of suspicious circumstances here. Why was he in the upstairs corridor at all? Why wasn't he at the Halloween feast?" And then they all launch into like explanations and stuff. But just that like way that he's like asking the question for his own purpose, and it's not even like he doesn't actually want to be helpful to them. He just wants to like criticize and get them in trouble.
Yeah, reading verse 5, I have been to some wildly uncomfortable dinner parties. But wow, who can't recognize this moment of someone making trouble for the sake of trouble when Judas asks that question? I've lived that too. Not so much with the, someone who's been continually stealing from someone else, but still. This must have been a moment about as tense as the reinstitution of the Slug Club and those dinners, because they did not sound comfortable at all.
Mm-hmm. Especially once Harry started asking about the memory.
Yeah. But I mean, even before then, like, if you're in the habit of having students over and, like, getting a group together and talking to them, you would think that eventually you'd get some skill at it. But no! Slughorn just continues to be horribly awkward.
Yeah,
I
he
don't
just cares about your connections.
Yeah. And then in verse 8, now part of this verse has often been translated as, you will always have the poor with you, which would be a very sad thing to say about the future. But the Greek doesn't actually imply that. Instead, the word will is not, it's not a prediction of the future. It's, you always have the poor with you. You do always have them with you, that kind
Statement
of
of fact about the present.
Yes, exactly. And given that in a previous verse Judas is said to be a thief, it's not really a surprise that Judas would often have the poor with him now, would he? Because they would be poorer because of him. Kind of like, as long as the Death Eaters continue to be around, Muggle-born prejudice is going to continue to be a force in society. Whereas, yes, okay, it would take more than just the end of the Death Eaters to get rid of the prejudice against Muggle-borns, but that would have to be a step in the process for society to no longer have that as a major function of their thing.
And it's partly about being in community, right? Like, you do have the poor with you is also, that's part of who you are as a community.
Right.
And so then it's also like, you do always have Muggle-borns with you. That's part of who you are as a community. You do always have.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for Holy Week.
This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Roloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, HP at Church. Or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles. So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on iTunes, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to be able to go back and listen to older episodes or get actual transcripts of the podcasts, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/HPATCHURCH.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.